we're live now.
Okay.
So I'll wait a few minutes for participants to join and then begin with the introduction. Okay, so let me begin with the introduction now while while people continue to join us. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to those joining us from other continents. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. It's a very challenging and difficult time for those of us in India as we have a second wave of COVID surging through our cities. I am Shahana Chattaraj, and I'm the Director of Research for WRI India. For those of you not familiar with us, WRI is a global research and implementation organization that works on sustainable and inclusive urbanization, climate change and resilience, energy transitions, forests, and sustainable food and agriculture. And this webinar is a part of a series of research-based discussions that focus on major new books and research works that are at the intersection of environment and development. So today's talk is going to focus on a major new report on Indian urbanization. It's probably the most significant and comprehensive analysis in a decade. And it's the State of the Cities report. And we have with us to discuss it Om Prakash Mathur, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Social Sciences and the lead author of this report. Om Prakash Mathur will be talking with our CEO of WRI India, Dr. OP Agarwal. So what this report does is that it explores the evidence and the data that underpin the sort of multiple narratives that we have of Indian urbanization that you'll all have come across, that it's simultaneously rapid and slow, that it's economically dynamic and messy, that it's hidden, but also very palpable and evident. And this report will focuses on three central dimensions of urbanization, on its demographics, the relationship with economic growth, and urban infrastructure and the environment. So the authors asked, and they seek to answer looking through multiple sources of data, is post-liberalization urbanization in India qualitatively and quantitatively different from earlier eras? Does it reflect macroeconomic changes in the Indian economy over these decades? And are our cities growing more or less productive, inclusive, and sustainable? And how do they compare with rural areas? After this, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. Both our speakers today are two of the most eminent experts on urban research and policy in India. And they have between them many, many decades of experience on both research and actual policy making in the field. So after I've introduced the speakers, I'll hand it over to Om Mathur, and he will speak and delve in some detail into the findings of the report for about 30 minutes. By the way, the report itself, there's a link to download it on the event page, and I strongly encourage anyone, all of you who work on or in urban India to download it and have a look through the report. So after Om Mathur's presentation for about 30 minutes, we'll have a discussion between Dr. Agarwal and Mr. Mathur, and that will be followed by a Q&A, an audience Q&A, which I'll moderate. And in the interest of time, I'll request you all to type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll consolidate some of them together so we can bring the common questions together. This session will be recorded, and for those of you who want to have a look at the recording after that, that will be available from WRI. Okay, I'll just introduce our two speakers and then hand over to Om Prakash Mathur is a senior fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi. He was previously director, National Institute for Urban Affairs, and held the IDFC chair in urban economics at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He's been the director, multi-level planning unit, the Planning Commission of India, United Nations project team leader, decentralization project for the government of Iran, and senior economist at the United Nations Center for Regional Development, Nagoya, Japan. He was a member of the former Prime Minister's National Review Committee on the JNN-URM mission, and then the JNN-URM Technical Advisory Group, the high-powered expert committee on urban infrastructure investment requirements, and the advisory group of experts on decentralization of UN habitat. He's currently a member of the GIZ ADB-sponsored City Development Initiative for Asia and the City Indicators Program hosted at the University of Toronto. Dr. OP Agarwal, who is currently the CEO of WRI India, prior to joining WRI, was the executive director of the Indian School of Business, and he chaired the US Transport Research Board's Committee on Transportation in Developing Countries. He's an eminent thinker and practitioner with a wealth of experience in cities, urban transport, climate change, and related development and environmental issues. He served as a member of the IAS and held several positions during from 1979 to 2007, including as head of the Urban Transport Division of the Government of India, where he authored India's National Urban Transport Policy, a document that outlined the priorities for sustainable urban transport at all levels of government. He holds a PhD from the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and a master's degree in transportation from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as well as a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from IIT Chennai. So thank you all again for joining us, and I'll now hand over to Om, who will discuss the report.
Thank you very much, Shahana and OP, for organizing this event. I deeply appreciate your interest in the work that my colleagues and myself have done over the past couple of years on this report. Since I have 30 minutes, let me come straight away to what we have done in this report, what it is all about, and why did we think it necessary to work on it, knowing very well that there were 5 other reports that had been done in India in the last 8-9 years or so. I'll explain all of that over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. There are 2 very specific purposes that underlie this work. One is, and both of these have been very briefly outlined by Shahana, but let me repeat. One is that if we go back to 1993-1994 period, when extraordinarily important changes were made in India's economic policy. From a very closed and regulatory system, the country was getting freed from those regulations. It was becoming partly open. It was open with the FDI. It had jettisoned, in a sense, the import substitution. and moved on to export-led economic development. Now, if we take the premise that urbanization is not a neutral factor in development, it follows that when the macroeconomic parameters change, the pace, the scale, the level, the composition, the structure of urbanization also need to simultaneously undergo changes. So one of the objectives, more academic in nature, and there's plenty of literature that says that the open economic systems, they promoted different kind of urbanization compared to one, which is a closed one. We wanted to really discern the changes within the country, what has happened to the whole process of urbanization. That was one objective. Second one, also referred to by Shahana, that those of you who have been looking at the reports of various kinds which have come out on India's urbanization, as well as the loosely made statements once in a while in media, India's the multiple narratives, such as it is slow, it is rapid, it is moderate, it is messy, it is hidden. Now, one of the things was that these could not have been all casual statements. There must be something in each of them. The purpose of the report was to get into what really underlies this statement, what underpins this statement. That was the second objective of this report. The study has a global context as well as an India context, and I think it's important that we look at it. The global context is, and I take you back to '68 when McNamara and the World Bank program on urbanization began to appear globally. In 1968, McNamara made a very profound statement. And what he said was that our understanding of urbanization, particularly of the developing countries, is very primitive. This is the word that he used, primitive. Very soon it was followed by Lester Brown's book. Lester Brown happened to be the Prime Minister of Canada. And he came out with a report, and he especially emphasized that developing countries should follow a small town system of developing urbanization. Large cities are dense of poverty, they're dense of social unrest, and they're dense of unemployment. Look at from 1968-69 to 1990, when the first World Bank paper came out, saying very loudly for the first time that cities are important for economic growth. That was the first breakthrough that we find, the World Bank paper of 1990, which was followed by another paper in 2000, which said that cities should become bankable, cities should become productive, they should become efficient, they should become competitive. Now, that kind of a change was slowly coming in. In the meantime, the UN Habitat also came out with as a dazzling figure. It says over 1 billion people in developing countries were in poverty, acute poverty. And the phrase that we used was that poverty was urbanizing itself in the developing countries. Now look at the change from 1968 to the stage where, on the one hand, countries were talking about economic growth in cities. On the other hand, they started talking about that cities are the ones that would really address the problems of poverty, particularly as it moves from the rural areas to the urban areas. Now, of course, further changes have taken place in recent years, and you will be surprised that international role for cities have been highlighted in all the three recent international agreements: the International Agreement on Climate Change, on the Sustainable Development Goal, as well as the New Urban Agenda. They say it is the cities that have to play a role in addressing this issue. So that kind of a global context is extremely important to bear in mind when we are doing a report on urbanization. Interestingly, somewhat similar things were happening in India as well. I do not know if you had a chance to look at our report, but if you will turn to page 10 and 11, where we have given a big chart, a threefold chart, that really traces our approach India's approach to urbanization right from the first 5-year plan until the 12th 5-year plan and the 3-year, the plan for 3 years, that is 2017, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20. It really traces how India has moved again exactly in the same manner as the world has moved, that in the first plan, our approach was a negative approach. The whole thing was India lived in villages and the future of India lies in rural development. From there, moved on to the small towns, the small and medium towns, to urban basic services for the poor, then on to JNNURM, and now smart cities. This kind of a development has also taken place in India, changing what urbanization can possibly do. A parallel development, OP, that was happening, interesting. And I'm sure that you would recall the 2016-17 economic survey of Government of India, where Arvind Subramaniam, which was his first economic survey, he raises the issue of the definition of what urban is all about. Now, obviously hurt by the fact that India is only 31% urban, and India is growing and so on and so forth, he came out with a suggestion that India's definition of urban is very demanding compared to other countries, and we need to begin to look at urbanization from a different angle, almost saying that we need to redefine or set a new definition for it. India was not alone in this. Other countries were doing exactly what India was doing. China, for instance, they changed this definition in the light of the huge migration that was taking place in China in order to spur their economic development. Huge migration, and villages were being urbanized, people were being brought to urban areas in order to stimulate urbanization-led growth. But the two changes which are important to mention, one was Uchida's sort of agglomeration index, highlighted in the 2009 report of the World Bank, where the main argument was coming so soon after, if you recall, Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. The World Bank came exactly the opposite. The world is not only not flat, but geography matters. And the whole context of discussion of urbanization began to change, with the agglomeration index becoming one of the measures of a country's urbanization. It was very soon taken over by technological changes, satellite imaging, also trying to show that not only we should look at urbanized agglomeration economies, but we should look at how urbanization is spreading itself, particularly in the subcontinent. And they gave a map showing that Delhi to Lahore is the busiest urban corridor in South Asia. And if only countries were really hinting at that, if only countries would begin to look at this corridor, India and Pakistan's sort of economic growth could accelerate several times. Now, it is just in the background that we took this study, and we'll come back to one or two points later. We have done, as Shahana mentioned, 3 things. We have looked at the demographics of urbanization. We have looked at the economic foundations of urbanization, and we have looked at infrastructure and environmental security, the extent to which they relate to cities and towns. Now, each one of them, you would notice, come with several commonly held notions. When it comes to demographics, the commonly held notions are, number one, that India is urbanizing rapidly. Number two, that rural to urban migration is a chief driver of urbanization in the country. And number three, large cities are growing at a very rapid rate. These are the commonly held notions around which our policies, our common statements keep on making, including in the official statements which come out. And if at some stage you would want to see them, I have in my files all the official statements. we looked at the evidence very closely. Just one thing here, OP and all those who are present in this meeting, we have been particular about evidence, and what we have done is we have used only formal data sets comparable over time. I want to emphasize the word comparable over time, because at a point in time, you can come out with any report and say that, look, this is what the situation is, without being able to compare it with what was happening in the previous one. So our entire report is based on formal data sets, which are comparable over time. We don't use any other data. Now, if you look at, and we have looked at the scale, we have looked at the pace, we have looked at the level, we have looked at the composition of urbanization, and we have looked at the spatial distribution across city sizes and across spaces. That's what we have done. Now, I will mention 3 or 4 things because time may not permit me to do all what we have done. One is that there's no question that scale of urban population growth in India is extremely high. There's no question about it. We added 90.2 million people in that decade of 2001, 2011, roughly about 9 million people, but 9 million, according to the UN urbanization prospects, 9 million could rise to as much as 11.5, 11.6 by the year 2030, and it could become even higher by the year 2050. One of the important points that the UN projections make, and I think it is interesting, is that by the year 2027, 28, around that time, rural population will begin to decline in absolute numbers. Not just the rate, but in absolute numbers, rural population will begin to decline. And from that year onwards, the population growth will all be in India's urban story, which is a very major statement that the UN has made. And I think it is important that we begin to take note of it in our policy responses and our policy debates. Right. So there is no question that our urban system at 377 million people in 2011, 7,933 urban centers of various sizes, is the second largest system in the world, and it continues to expand at a phenomenal rate. There's no question about it. But the moment you begin to break it down to other components, such as the pace at which it's growing. Now, we normally take the pace, it's 2.7% growth rate per annum, which is the growth rate between 2001 2011. But the academic sort of advances that have been made in the whole methodological issues, and if you see Mike Cohen's sort of recent book, not recent, but about 10 years old book, or if you see Mark Montgomery's work at the National Science Foundation, both of them are saying it is not simply the growth rate of urban population which is important. What is important is the rate of growth of the urban share of population. And the moment you shift your attention from a simple annual exponential growth rate to growth rate of the urban share of population, India is among the slowest growing countries in the world. And you will see a graph where we have compared the average growth rate worked out this way in a graph that we compares with 153 countries of the world, and India is almost at the, not exactly at the bottom, but among the slowest growing countries. So this is one fact that really explains why some of us keep saying that India's urbanization is slow, and we keep saying it is rapid when we look at the scale of growth, 9 million people, 10 million people every year to be added. The real part in the demographics is the rural to urban migration, where right from, it has all this literature is amazingly large on this. and we have reviewed the literature, and you will find that in the report as well, that the common notion that rural to urban migration is rapid is completely wrong. I mean, I should put this. It is subdued, and it is hovering around 21, 22% of the total increase in urban population. The interesting part about rural to urban migration, which the literature argues and which has been argued globally, that urban transformation in any country is really a function of migration, which bring with it all kinds of innovations and all kinds of adventure, which really comes with that one. And if we compare it with what is going on in the country at this point, where every state coming out with a legislation that 75% of work would be reserved for locals and so on and so forth, this would be the biggest impediment to economic growth of the future. And the sooner we realize it, sooner we recognize it, would be much better for the country. The only public figure who has been commenting on it is Naushad Forbes, who has been writing on it quite continuously, that these laws which are injurious to economic growth, injurious to innovations, innovation to entrepreneurship, and the sooner we get rid of them, so much would be better for the country. In a webinar that we had on the subject just a few weeks back, the Chinese example was brought in here, and he says our the economic growth is almost entirely due to the migration that took place deliberate as a part of deliberate policy, bringing rural workers into cities and making the work initially in the labor-intensive industries and later on in other industries as well. And the third aspect of this, is which we have been talking about, is really the census towns, which have really grown, where people are less conscious as to what they really mean to urbanization. Is that have they brought in greater uncertainty in projecting it, or should we just accept that this is a normal feature? Every settlement changes character over time, and we should accept it as an urban phenomenon and start planning for that one. Compared to that one, as you would probably see, the growth of statutory towns in the past decade has been just about 2.02%, while the growth rate of the census towns has been amazingly large all over the country. So you will see that. The result of this change that has kept the way urbanization has unfolded itself, it brings four kinds of urbanization in the country. One, which are still fertility-led urban population growth. Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, to some extent Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Odisha is just coming out of that one, but they're really fertility-led urban population growth. And the implication of this is pretty obvious, that as long as fertility driven, it's just population growth, it is not urbanization. We are not saying that loudly, but the fact is that it's not urbanization. There's simple natural growth in any place, in any city and so on. The second category is which are just census town-led urbanization. And the two states which excel here, one is West Bengal and second is Kerala, where almost 60 to 70 to 80% of urban population growth has been in census towns, being incorporated slowly into the urban setting. The third is where migration has been an important factor, which means that roughly about 35%, 36% of the net increment has taken place on account of rural to urban migration, a very important factor. But the fourth category is where it has been a highly balanced kind of thing, some fertility-led, some migration-led, census-led. And these states, if you go into the literature will tell us that this is the long-term stability is ensured when so many different factors really stimulate or provide the impetus to urbanization. Let me shift to the economic foundations. No, the last point is about the metropolitan areas, I think equally important, where once again, the common notion being the large cities are growing very rapidly. If you decompose the growth rate of the metropolitan or the urban agglomeration with 1 million population plus, if you decompose it, you come up with very interesting patterns. You come up with metropolitan city UAs, where both the core as well as the periphery, they're declining in population. They're not growing. The other extreme is where both the core is growing as well as the periphery is growing, very buoyant kind of a growth. You also see where core is not growing, but periphery is growing. And there is a majority of metropolitan cities fall into that category. And there are others where the periphery is not growing, but only core is growing. So you have this highly complex pattern where core periphery relations have become an important factor, which somehow we have not been either deliberately conscious of, we have not taken note of that, or we are sort of do not interfere in what the state government would want to do with them, that is not recognize them as urban centers, simply leave them as rural part, because that's the advantage of rural areas when it comes to grants and centrally sponsored schemes and granting aids. So this is as far as the demographics. Let me come to the second part, which is economic foundations, where once again we are driven by the common notion that cities really produce 60% of the GDP. Sometimes we also hear statements coming out from the Niti Aayog, oh, cities are producing 70% of GDP. The moment you look at the fact, you will see the CSO does bring out the urban-rural share of GDP when it changes this base year series of the GDP. It's not a regular feature of this CSO. The breakup is done only once in a while when the base year of GDP changes, which roughly takes place either once in 5 years or once in 7 years. We were expecting why the report was delayed. This report was delayed was we were waiting for the 2018-19 figures on the rural-urban share of GDP as well as on the urban-rural consumption. That report was held up for technical reasons by the government of India. You know, the GDP became a contentious issue in the later years of this country. So we are stuck with 2011 figures. The 2011 figures for urban share of GDP is 52.3%. But 31% population producing 52%. That is the kind of a ratio that we get, and certainly not anywhere with 60% or 70% that this figure keeps coming out in many of the statements. The critical part here is, and that has been raised by academically by Durant. I do not know whether OP had a chance to meet him in Washington, DC. Durington has raised, looking at these regressions, he raises an issue. So we understand the cities and economic growth go together. We understand that. We also understand the regressions are positive between these two. But how much of that increase in GDP, if the correlation shows that that it is 5%, 1% of 1% increase in urbanization level leads to 5% increase in GDP. The question that he's raising is, how much of that increase is on account of urbanization? Urbanization cannot be the sole factor in GDP growth. There are so many other factors, and he has almost taken the global community to a major task. He says, we all keep talking about the correlation, the R squares and so on and so forth, but how much of that increase in GDP should be or can be attributed to increase in urbanization? And that answer is still awaited. And I think in the next couple of, or maybe a decade, people will be struggling to find that out. In India also, the same figure is pretty positive. It's about 5% to 6% or something. But the moment you further decompose it and look at the Y values in the regression part, you find that while globally 1% increase is associated with 3.3, 3.4% of GDP increase, in India, 1% increase in GDP is associated with only 1.77% increase. So India's urbanization far less productive, even though the R square might be somewhat similar, but India's urbanization far less productive compared to the global figures, and we have compared it with 155, 56 countries globally. So India is far less productive than what we convey, by giving out these figures from time to time that India's cities are producing this much. We have been arguing this point within the Niti Aayog, and once in a meeting we did say that if only India's 31, 32% of population was producing 60 or 70% of GDP, Indian cities would be, and with all the deficits that we keep talking about, Indian cities would be among the most productive cities anywhere in the world. So I think we need to share our commonly held position that India's cities produce 60% of the market. Much more worrying factor, looking at the 2011 data, is that the share of manufacturing, urban shares of manufacturing, urban shares of real estate GDP, and urban shares of financial services, the rate of growth has begun to decline, even as at this level of India's urbanization. The worrying part is not globally they are declining, but at this level, when we are only 32, 33% urban, if you begin to see the dip at such a low level of urbanization, it certainly is a cause for immense worry. Where is productivity going? Some have argued that, look, the way GDP is calculated may be responsible for this kind of a misconnect, and that could well be true, but we don't know that. That the census towns, which now account for 14% population, their GDP may not be counted as part of urban, that may still be counted as rural. That could be a possibility, but we just don't know whether that is a fact or that is not a fact. So it's a very growing concern. Also, you will very interesting phenomenon that you come is the informalization of the workforce in the urban areas going at a much rapid pace. And the opposite is formalization of the workforce in the rural areas becoming quite dominant right now. Now, which is completely it surprises us that rural areas becoming more formal in terms of workforce, and the urban areas are becoming more informal, affecting the urban productivity in very, very major way. And if we and it could have serious implications for economic growth in the coming years. Let me shift to infrastructure. I know my time is running out, and I have just about not more than 5 minutes. I'll try and finish it. The infrastructure story is, again, we also always tend to say that because of the rapid urbanization, our infrastructure has not been able to keep pace with it. Once again, if you look at very closely, you look at the growth rate of the infrastructure, household coverage over time, then you see the rate of urbanization, and you begin to compare. This assertion, which is often made, is incorrect. The states which have become fast, which are urbanizing at a faster rate, also are those states which have somehow managed to increase their infrastructure coverage of households as well. So this assertion that urbanization causes shortages is not held by the numbers that we have, and the numbers are all formal. They're all forwarded to government source. Also, interestingly, our focus has so far been on access to services. That's it. We have not yet gone from access to adequacy. We have not yet gone on distribution across income groups. We have not looked at the affordability. We have not looked at the pricing issues. So our story of infrastructure, and that's the main interventions that we have made over the past 20, 30, 40 years, is limited to access part, not adequacy, not distribution across income groups, not affordability, and not pricing. And that, once again, is a very fragmented kind of a picture. We have worked out the shortages by using the UN SDG norm that no one to be left behind by 2030. If that is the goal, that by 2030, no one is to be left behind, then our task is a phenomenal task to be done between 2021 and 2030. We have combined the results in order to show how urban is India, but that's more like a mechanical exercise, and the results are not surprising. The only surprise, not a surprise, but the dismaying fact that comes out is that if you divide all these indicators that are used in the analysis belonging to urbanization on the one hand, productivity on the other, and inclusion and access, the third part, there's a huge disconnect between these two. While some of the statements are pretty high in the cumulative index, but when you look at the index separately computed for urbanization, separately computed for productivity, separately computed for inclusion, they're very different. They're very different. When you combine them, you get a high rank, but sometimes you have a very low rank on the inclusion, high in productivity and higher urbanization, and these combinations keep on changing. So it's a very uneven kind of urbanization that we're seeing if we use them in the form of an index. My last two or three comments, and I would be very, very quick. I said in the beginning that there are at least 5, 6 major publications, beginning with McKinsey's work in 2009, HPEC's work, the report came out in 2011, which was followed by World Bank's report on beyond municipalities, urbanization beyond municipalities in 2013. Then we got 2015 report of the World Bank, leveraging urbanization in South Asia, and the India's National Urban Report for the Habitat 3. 5 very major reports. I was associated with all of them. With McKinsey, I was on the academic panel. HPEC, I was a member. I was a consultant to the 2 reports of the World Bank, doing special papers for them. And I wrote the National Urban Report for the Habitat 3. And question was asked when I proposed to the ministry that we would like to work on urbanization report. The question, and it was Rajiv Mishra, who was the additional secretary at that time. He said, "Aren't you tired of it? Do you think you would still come out with something different, which is not covered in these 5 reports?" And my answer was that I wouldn't come to you if I was going to repeat what has already been done. There was a purpose in each of those 5 reports. McKinsey was interested in putting out the figure of $1.2 trillion requirement. Isha's report was 39 lakh crore investment. That was, everything was centered around that one. Barring the 2000 report of the World Bank, beyond municipalities, which were more research-based. Even the 2015 report, the message was empowerment, finance, and accountability are central to making anything possible if you want to deal with urbanization. National report was almost to say that, well, this is all that India does. That's a global report, and we can quite understand. You compare our report with that one. We have looked at the evidence and with multiple lenses in order to get a better grip of how it has unfolded itself in the country. And my big key message that is important is that these notions, wide notion that we have, is not going to help in really formulating an urban policy and designing future approaches. In fact, you could get a very different. The moment you say rapid, the implied meaning is that you need to slow it down, that we are not too happy about. So the implications of each statement has to be properly understood. The second point is that our report is not prescriptive in nature. We have emphasized the analytics. And Shahana, I think she was interested in knowing the urban theories. And this is one report we have used extensively, the literature, the relevant literature, beginning with 1862, when for the first time the word urbanization, I can't pronounce the French, the Spanish translation of it, which is the original, was invented and came into usage. We have gone right from 1862 to 1936, when Louis Wirth really came out with a seminal paper, Urbanism as a Way of Life, followed by Kingsley Davies and so on and so forth, and more recent work by Lee Brenner and Lefebvre and so on and so forth. We have done that. And likewise, we have used the theories like going to Kisterer's central place theory or Zipf's law, which we have used quite we have given only the summary, but not really used it very much, or Gibrat law, or the law that says that it's really like an inverted U-shaped curve, urbanization, it goes up and it begins to taper and decline, or even that the rate of growth is independent of sizes. We have used all of that in our report. Right from Arthur Lewis, when he started for the first time, he made in 1954. And he gave us a lecture at the D School. I was doing my MA. And what he said, which is significant, that 25% of agricultural labor force would be removed without making any difference to agricultural output. Now, that was the kind of migration he foresaw for the country, that where output is not getting affected, why would you not promote rural to urban migration, bring them to cities to enable them to make their contribution? We think it is work in progress. Just the other day, we were discussing with OP one or two things that we need to work on. There's amazing amount of literature on municipal finance. In fact, we agreed that we should do something about it, and let's hope that we work continues in one way or the other. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I have taken 5 or 7 minutes more than you had given to me, but thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Om. That was a very illuminating and thought-provoking discussion about a very illuminating report. And what I thought it did remarkably well is kind of disentangle. Oh, am I muted?
No, it's not very. I'm not getting it now.
Okay. Is disentangle the very, these kind of complex and seemingly contradictory narratives, all of which have data to support them, of Indian urbanization without losing sight of the heterogeneity and complexity. And it does a wonderful job of that. And I think that's what the best empirical work does. It kind of brings some clarity and shows us clear trends and patterns in a very complex and heterogeneous space like Indian urbanization. I'll now hand over to OP, and he'll react and discuss, have some questions with you for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have an audience Q&A. OP?
Thanks, Shahana, and thanks, Om. It's not the first time that I've heard you, but it's as mesmerizing as any of the earlier talks that I've heard you give. So it's always a joy to listen to you, always so much learning and listening to you. This has been no different. Some of the things that you brought up are so different from what the general perception has been. And what I'm capturing from what you said so far, this whole wrong notion that most of the urban growth is happening through rural to urban migration. I think that's very revealing. Your comment about, even though in absolute numbers we've been growing well, 9 million people a year, but the share of the urban growth has been slow. The growth in the urban share of the population has been growth. I think a very important thing that you brought up in this report is this sudden spike or growth in the number of census towns. I think that's again a fascinating revelation. The analysis that you did in terms of the core versus periphery, again, very fascinating. It would really be nice to hear a little more on this from you and get an understanding of why something is happening in a certain manner in a certain city and why it is happening differently in another city. So that's one of the points I'd like you to tell us a little more about. The other thing you mentioned was, generally we believe that 60% of the GDP is coming from the urban areas. You said it's about 52%, certainly not anything close to 60 or 70%. That's really fascinating. You spoke about India's, the productivity of India's urbanization has not been comparable to the productivity of global urbanization. Again, very fascinating, but I'd like to hear a little more on why do you think that is happening? The very important point that you made about the share of manufacturing and construction in the urban areas declining, and a very interesting point of greater informalization of the urban workforce, and surprisingly, greater formalization of the workforce in rural areas. I mean, these are completely contrary to what one believed, but you've shown what's happening here. I think a very powerful point that you made about a number of services which are, we have focused on access. We haven't focused on adequacy or affordability or pricing, all those things. So, a broad question based on all of these, or let me say two questions based on all of these. One is, what do you think is at the crux of why things are happening differently to what has happened elsewhere? Number one. The second question I'd like to ask you, or sort of get your thoughts on.
Can you repeat?
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, but can you just, I missed your point.
So the first thing is, why is it happening? There must be some underlying feature behind all of this. Why is it that we are, informalization in the urban workforce versus formalization in the rural workforce? The share of, the urban productivity of urbanization not being as good as in the rest of the world. What do you think is the underlying feature behind all of these? Number one. The second I'd like to sort of get your thoughts on is, if based on this, you've been involved with so many of these last 5 reports, you've been involved in this, you've been involved in a lot of things that have been happening in the government. But if you were to ask the government or suggest to the government 2 major policy issues that they should focus on, or 1 or 2 things that they should focus on differently from what they are doing today, what would they be?
OP, you are asking me a question that you are in a better position to answer, having been in the center of policy making. But let me try. One is that our unwillingness to look at data as they ought to be looked at. This could well be on account of the fact that we have made up our mind that that is so, and let's proceed with that. There is no need for looking at it. You would have faced it in your long tenure with the government, and since I was with the Planning Commission, and those 4 years that I spent, and I think they were the most educational 4 years that I've spent of my career anywhere in the world. Where each and every decision, the rationale for taking a decision, the kind of background work that we were required to do for taking one decision, and decision taken was different from all the work that we did. Maybe political expediency, maybe some other reasons that it suits certain interest groups, and therefore we need to take that. I mean, the 4 years I spent in the Planning Commission, that was the time when Mrs. Gandhi gave the call Garibi Hatao. And our task as in charge of various units was how to translate the slogan of Mrs. Gandhi into the various things that you were responsible for in the Planning Commission. And we worked very hard on that one. But precisely, I mean, for example, the ULSA, the Urban Land Ceiling Act, it was designed primarily to implement Mrs. Gandhi's agenda, that 500 square meters, no more, surrender it. Start backward areas development program. So all of these were knitted together in one way form, but by the time they came, the after effect, the implications of all that, the moment India began to open, the Urban Land Ceiling Act became the biggest impediment to land development, land acquisition, and so on and so forth. Became the biggest impediment. And then we all know the problems that we did. So one is we remain puzzled with respect to the whole process of this. I mean, it's nothing personal, and nothing with this government or that government. You look at the 12th five-year plan. If you look at it right on the first or the second page, there's one box which is on smart cities. On the smart cities, that this is what it is. This is what we would like to do. A conscious decision was taken in a meeting with the former Prime Minister that India is not ripe for smart cities. Government failed. In 2014, government changed, and from nowhere, we had 100 smart cities on the program. And those smart cities, without even knowing what the rationale was, without knowing what it involved, without knowing what it entails, we started doing it. Now, maybe some smart cities have gone forward. They're very well. I mean, I have no idea. I have not evaluated. So the decision-making process and the database, much as we might say that we need stronger databases, but distaste for looking at data is so strong here that we just don't know what's going on. So this is one kind of response. Our productivity has been falling anyway. The urban productivity, not knowing, the import substitution versus export-led, we don't know where we stand. We don't know about now it has been, the further growing uncertainty about it with the Atmanirbhar, whether we are open, whether we are closed, or whether we are close to some, whether whether it is once again import substitution. I mean, what does Atmanirbhar mean? The import substitution. So the moment we are import substitution, we are irrespective of the cost of production. And that is where the productivity will be affected very seriously. irrespective of the cost of production, it is produced locally. The competition is gone. And obviously, we would, once competition is gone, to bring back on a stage where India can become competitive again is almost impossible. Only a few industries are competitive. And I do not know whether you saw yesterday, yeah, it was yesterday's newspaper, talking about India's foreign investment in other countries, which was very interesting. That instead of investing in your own country, you find it far more profitable to invest in other countries and make money out of that. Now, our foreign investments in other countries are growing very rapidly. They're shunning the Indian production sort of frontiers and moving out. So you find these various kinds of disconnects and various kinds of these small things which keep hitting you once in a while.
But in here, so what you're probably implying from this is it's probably easier to do business outside than to do it in India.
Obviously. The big article in yesterday's newspaper. Big article.
No, let me.
And the comparison was made between India and China. And they said they do not like Chinese because Chinese come with almost everything, including their own labor, while Indians are still relying on their local labor, and therefore they are welcomed, while the Chinese investment is not welcome. Although in terms of scale, the two are at very different platforms.
One more quick point I'll bring up, and then I think there are some very interesting questions coming on the Q&A, which I'll request Shahana to sort of summarize for you. But you said this thing about, I'm bringing you back to my second question. There is an unwillingness to look at data, which is true. I mean, I've quite seen that in all the years that I've spent in the government. The tendency often is to make an assessment based on your own experience and then try to take things forward rather than looking at data and sort of getting something consistent. But now that you've looked at data, you've seen the data, you've done the analysis, if you were to make a suggestion to the government of what should be actions that they need to take or changes in direction that they should adopt compared to what's happening now, what would those suggestions be? And maybe, just to put a sort of thought in your mind, whether I'm right in this assessment or not. The sense I get is there is far too much of a focus on what I call the civil engineering mindset. Build A, build B, build C. But what we are missing out is that bigger picture of a city. What is that city supposed to do? What are the urban areas supposed to do? Do we have that in mind while deciding what we want to build and what we do not want to build? Do you see that kind of a trend? I'll be happy if you tell me I'm wrong, but what is your sense?
No, I hope you are absolutely right. And that was also the main tenor of your recent article, that it is a civil engineering thought that pervades all through. It's a very dominant thought. You keep reading that this highway will take, you could drive 150 kilometers an hour. Or you could, but the example that you were giving, that we have highways of this kind in metros without having a proper bus service in the town. You don't have a bus service, but you have a metro. So somehow it doesn't gel. I mean, the two. I thought that two are planned together. That two are planned together, where the bus service will be more efficient. I don't know. I mean, you are the transport man. I should not have taken this example anyway before a transport person. But it's very surprising that you don't have a bus, but you have a metro, which is not the case in Japan. Japan, the buses are equally efficient. Buses run.
No, I mean, if you look at it another way, we have an urban transport policy, but we don't have an urbanization policy.
That's right.
An urban transport policy, to my mind, would flow from an urbanization policy. But we don't have, so you have the daughter, but you don't have the mother. It's sort of something of that sort. So this is
housing policy or housing program, big one. You have infrastructure where solid waste and water are being looked at. You have transport, but you don't know the frame within which these are functioning. And obviously the suboptimality in terms of what they would produce becomes pretty obvious, that you're looking at sectors, but not the whole story. The disconnect that I talked about really emanate from such sort of such actions. We know that overall frames are more difficult, and then even more difficult to have the parts, and then they become then making them consistent with each other. That is really the input-output analysis that we read at one point in time, but that's beside the point.
Let me go back to Shahana. I think there are some very interesting questions in the Q&A.
Sure.
You may want to sort of, Shahana, over to you.
Thank you, OP and Om. That was a great discussion. I think we can have a whole separate session or workshop on the implications for urban policy, because there's just some great points coming up. But for now, I'm going to just quickly go over. We don't have much time left. We have about 10 minutes, so I will just quickly consolidate and give you all the questions briefly, and you can sort of decide which ones you will be able to answer in this short time. They're all great questions, but many of them might be rather long. But and you can also see them actually in the Q&A if you want to have a look. So the first question is from Kaustubh Das, and he's saying that given that urbanization has been conclusively associated with the wealth creation, that large cities are saturated and overburdened, and the fastest growth, the higher rates of urbanization are in tier 2 and tier 3 cities in India. And he says that such cities offer limited opportunities. And in such a scenario, should we have more regional conurbations of cities as seen in Randstad in Europe? I guess what he's speaking is about this whole kind of regional and metropolitan urban systems, which a lot of people are talking about. Anjali's question focuses on data and possible data gaps. And she's asking how your study accounted for people in informal settlements, migrants and informal workers that are not necessarily captured in formal data sets. And she asked to what extent could the lower than expected share of urban GDP or employment be because urban informal jobs are not captured in the data sets that you're using. So she'd like to know, how much this can explain and how these aspects were captured. A question from Deepti. This is a really interesting question. She was saying a few years ago, when prospects seemed much brighter, India's demographic dividend was celebrated. But now that India has one of the highest unemployment rates and also an aging population in cities, how does this affect how we see the urban transition and the demographic dividend that's of a youth bulge that we have? And finally, this is of course an important question given our current situation. Are these pandemics and lockdowns going to affect longer term trends in urbanizations in any way? Will they be positive or negative? In that many migrants are moving back to villages, and this may perhaps even further depress the already slow rates of migration. So Oma, I'll hand over to you. You can choose which ones you want to prioritize given the time frame we have.
Thank you very much for asking these questions. They're really very germane to the whole discussion. Let me pick up the third one first, the demographic part, which has been our story, that India has a demographic dividend, and therefore it has an advantage over China, and then put it bluntly. This is one point that I wanted to make in my presentation as well, but I sort of slipped out of my attention. Simply look at the age distribution for each of the states. And the moment you begin to look at the age distribution for each of these states, you find very interestingly that some of the states have demographic dividend, that is 15 to 24. And many of the states also simultaneously have aging, that is the proportion of population in excess of 60 years of age. Now, obviously, the question that anyone would ask is, what is the nature of the states that have aging issue? And what is the nature of the states that have the demographic dividend part? You would be surprised, Shahana, that demographic dividend is a characteristic of poor states. That's Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, where population in 15 to 24 is far in excess of the overall average. For the simple reason that the fertility rates in those states are very, very high. And where is aging? Aging is very high in Kerala, followed by Tamil Nadu, to some extent Karnataka, and to some extent Andhra Pradesh. And these are the states where the fertility rates are extremely low. And they have started facing the problem of aging. And if you recall, this was one of the issues that was raised by the Finance Commission, because Finance Commission, when they started, said, look, we will use the 2011 data. The southern states put up a huge fight. They said, look, if you take that, just because UP and Bihar, they keep producing more children, and they have a larger population share now in population, they will get more money. And just because we have exercised our restraint and put all our restraints. So this is once again, my submission was to the honorable person who is asking this question, that don't use demographic dividend as a universal phenomenon for the country as a whole. Look at state by state, and you will get a better picture. And then you will really discover where the challenges are. Challenges for the southern states are much different, where they need aging to be dealt with. And here is the unemployment problem, and these are also incidentally the states which send out migrants, and where these are also the states where all kinds of problems are arising with local. Then is the second question of the data gaps in informal, and the person is quite right that our definitions of formal, informal are extremely vague. They're very flimsy definition. The only definition which is quite firm is the census definition, where they give data on main workers and marginal workers. And marginal is assumed to be informal. Likewise, the labor bureau's data are organized and unorganized rather than formal and informal, and we just have to substitute the word unorganized for informal. And that's the only way we can explain informalization of the workforce or the informalization of production. The critical part here is that this is not just our problem. This is the developing countries' problem, and anyone familiar with the ILO's report, the annual reports, will discover that informalization is increasing worldwide. And now you are seeing not just informalization, but also yet another category, formal, informal, and another category of workforce, which is the gig economy. And one does not really know whether they're formal or informal in the strict sense of the word. These two concepts are defined. So the whole workforce composition is undergoing. There's a very nice chart that we have given in our report, in the section on the tracking the employment part, and which we have borrowed from the ILO, where you will see all these changes in the structure of employment, where regular employment is almost becoming now a rare phenomenon, and that being replaced by gig economy on the one hand, or limited contract, but a regular or permanent employee, which we were used to in India at one point in time, is going out of fashion. So this is one change, and it has nothing to do with pandemic. It has been happening over time that the changes are coming. Our approach to informalization was really from the time when, I forget the name of the author, when he said that slums are not a problem, but a solution to the problem. Now, from that time onwards, our approach to informal which earlier was disregarded as a negative feature of any economy, was resurrected in a sense and given a kind of a good place in the employment structure, that informality is not necessarily a negative feature of any economy. It could also bring out positive gains for any country. So the words or the concepts that are being used, the unorganized, marginal, which are still not very clearly defined in this sense, and I guess one will have to wait until the workforce composition is more formally structured with greater clarity on the concepts. The third question was, the first one was largely the sexual rating. Now here, I have a very serious disagreement with it. Now this is really going back to the research of 68, 69, and the number of books that came on the economics of city size. I would recommend to the questionnaire person that he or she should really read Economics of City Size by William Olonji. And then Harry Richardson did a lot of work on that point in time. The issue there was that beyond a certain point, the argument was diseconomies of scale settled. You know, how the question came, the large divide, that diseconomy is settled when cities reach a particular size, and after that, yet the unit cost of providing infrastructure begins to rise. There were empirical work done on India in 1968 at Stanford. That was my first major I should say, introduction to the real urban sort of work. And what was found in that one, and that was supported not just by the India study, but also many other studies that were done, that the curve, it was really the U-shaped curve, the attenuated one, where it was exactly U-shaped curve that the costs are very high when settlements are small. The unit cost continues to decline up to a point, and then the rise when size of the settlement goes beyond a certain point. That was the hypothesis. The field level data showed that while the unit costs continue to decline as city size rises, but unit costs do not rise when the city size increases beyond a certain point. Now, I would once again suggest that those studies were done long time ago, when our statistical systems, including a telephone call, for example, from making a telephone from Ludhiana to Delhi would take as much as 35 to 40 minutes. That's what is recorded in the report. And we could not sort of give a money value to this time, that how much does it affect the production cost? We could not do that. Our understanding of econometrics in 68 was not good enough to give a money value to the time. But now times are different, and those studies should certainly be taken up to get some fresh evidence on economies of scale or the diseconomies of scale. The point was about pandemic and migration. Once again, I mean, Amitabh Kundu, our good friend, he has been talking about exclusionary urbanization for a long time. But this migration is out-migration that we saw, and we might see it again, was simply the inability of the city governments to sort of recognize that these are settlements which are worth living, or you know, we have been talking about slum upgrading, God knows for how many decades, but actually slum upgrading has not taken place anywhere. They continue to draw water in Delhi. We all live in Delhi. Go to Sangam Vihar. The private sector supplies water through bore wells, he has supplied to each household a syntax tank of 500 liters. And he charges from every household 180 rupees a month, but water is assured. But the moment pandemic took place, all the supplies were cut off. My chap ran away. So there was no water. What would you expect? People have no water, they have no income, they have nothing to pay for. So they fled the country. But to assume from here that they were not making any contributions to city growth would be a misplaced assumption, in my view. They're making assumptions if we don't treat them well. But they came back. They came back to Maharashtra, now they're going back again. It's simply the inability of our inability to do. I can't give a more definite answer because I don't have any data to be able to say.
Thank you so much, Om. We have more questions coming in, but we're already running late. So the fascinating discussion. Again, I encourage everyone to download the report. I think it's a critical reference work for all of us, and I'll certainly be referring it to it often when I'm doing my own research. So thank you all. We can wrap up now. Stay safe and take care this challenging time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Shahana. Thanks for organizing this. You took the lead in organizing it. It was, to me, fascinating. Thanks very much. Again, thanks to Om. Always a delight to hear you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much, Shahana. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you all for joining us. Stay safe.